What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another A Song of Ice and Fire video. If you have been watching my channel very recently, then you would know I am making a video on each chapter from each book. My most recent video was about Bran Stark's first chapter, and in that video I went over some of the connections between House Stark and the White Walkers. What I want to do now is dive a little deeper into that subject. I happen to believe there is a significant amount of evidence for this scattered throughout the book series. The White Walkers and House Stark have been connected to one another since the very beginning. Their connection began roughly 8,000 years ago during the Long Night when the White Walkers were created and House Stark was founded. As I have said before, I do not think this is a coincidence whatsoever, so let's go through some of the evidence that has been laid out for us in the books. Now, based on what we know from one of Old Nan's stories, this all started thousands and thousands of years ago when a winter fell that was cold and hard and endless beyond all memory of man. There came a night that lasted a generation, and kings shivered and died in their castles, even as the swineherds in their hovels. Women smothered their children rather than see them starve, and cried and felt the tears freeze on their cheeks. In that darkness, the others came for the first time, she said as her needles went click, click, click. They were cold things, dead things that hated iron and fire and the touch of the sun, and every creature with hot blood in its veins. So as you can see, Old Nan says thousands and thousands of years ago, a winter fell. That's a very interesting choice of words if you ask me. Now the only reason why this winter fell was because the White Walkers invaded Westeros. They brought the winter with them, causing the Long Night. They slaughtered everything and everyone as they went further and further south. How the Long Night actually ended is a matter of legend. In the north, they tell of a last hero who sought out the children of the forest. His companions, abandoning him, are dying one by one as they faced ravenous giants, cold servants, and the others themselves. Alone, he finally did reach the children, despite the efforts of the White Walkers. Thanks to the children, the first men of the Night's Watch banded together and were able to fight and win the Battle for the Dawn, the last battle that broke the endless winter and sent the others fleeing to the icy north. Now, we don't have a lot of information on this event, but what we do know is the White Walkers brought the Long Night when they invaded Westeros. Then, a legendary figure known as the Last Hero found the Children of the Forest. He eventually joined forces with the first men of the Night's Watch, and together they were able to send the White Walkers back into the far north. Now this is speculation, but I happen to think the Last Hero was one of the first members of House Stark, along with Brandon the Builder. This is also when House Stark began naming their house sword Ice, and I believe this also symbolizes their defeat over the White Walkers. The Stark sword that we are introduced to is only 400 years old, but the name it had was older still, a legacy from the Age of Heroes when the Starks were kings of the North. The Long Night happened during the Age of Heroes, and I think this is when the Starks began using that name for their swords. In one of Sam's chapters, we learn something very interesting. It says, "I found one account of the Long Night that spoke of the Last Hero slaying others with a blade of dragon steel. Supposedly, they could not stand against it." After the Last Hero sent the White Walkers fleeing back into the north, I believe he gave his sword the name Ice to represent his victory over the White Walkers. This would also be a reminder that this is the kind of blade you have to defeat them. That's why the Starks continued to name their house sword Ice even after all these years. But a lot of this information had been forgotten. The name of their sword Ice, as well as their house words, Winter is Coming, is all connected to the White Walkers. After the White Walkers were defeated and sent north, this is when Brandon the Builder made the Wall and Winterfell in hopes of stopping the White Walkers from ever coming back south again. The greatest castle of the north is Winterfell, the seat of the Starks since the Dawn Age. Legend says Brandon the Builder raised Winterfell after the generation-long winter known as the Long Night, to become the stronghold of his descendants, the Kings of Winter. So as you can see, the Stark's castle was built immediately after the Long Night ended, and this was for a few different reasons in my opinion. First, let's look at the name of the castle, Winterfell. I think it was given this name as a reminder of what happened during the Long Night. Remember what Old Nan said, thousands and thousands of years ago, a winter fell, when the White Walkers invaded Westeros. Although the White Walkers were defeated, they were still alive in the far north. All it says is the Last Hero and the first men of the Night's Watch sent them fleeing into the icy north. The White Walkers never went extinct. They knew the White Walkers could always come back one day. That's why Brandon the Builder had that giant wall constructed to stop them from invading again. But just in case they ever made it south again, they needed a second line of defense. This is why I think he made Winterfell next, and they gave it that name to symbolize this horrific event. It was a reminder, the same as the Stark's house words, "Winter is coming." These names and phrases were to remind the Starks of what was in the far north. I believe this is also why a Stark must remain in Winterfell, for when and if the White Walkers ever resurfaced. The last hero, who I believe was one of the first members of House Stark, was able to defeat them, so I think they thought they would need another Stark to defeat them again. I mean, it's no coincidence that the Starks were set up as the family to face off against them in the current story. The Children of the Forest and Bloodraven were watching over Bran Stark and Jon Snow because they knew it would have to be one of the members from this ancient house that defeats them again. This is one of the reasons why they were known as the Kings of Winter. They are from a special bloodline that was able to go face to face with the White Walkers and win. Also, as I have said before, I believe Winterfell was built in this exact location because this is where the first Night King, or King of Winter, was defeated. There are a few things said in the books that let us know this is a very special location. We learned that the Crypts of Winterfell were made first, and they just so happen to be sitting right above some natural hot springs. This is why the inside of the castle is able to stay fairly warm even during the winter. I think they also chose this location because of what they wanted to bury down inside of those crypts beneath Winterfell. There is some evidence in the books that indicates there are White Walkers or some version of a Night's King or Night's Queen locked up down there. There are several references in the books that say the statues in the crypts have eyes made of ice, another direct connection to the White Walkers. In the opening scene of the series, we meet the White Walkers when 3 men of the Night's Watch go out beyond the wall to find some wildling raiders. When Will sees one of the White Walkers, he notices their eyes are blue, but they are deeper and bluer than any human eyes. They were a blue that burned like ice. We learn about the Kings of Winter having eyes of ice when Ned Stark goes down into the Crypts of Winterfell. When Ned is walking down there, it says, he was walking through the crypts beneath Winterfell as he had walked 1,000 times before. The Kings of Winter watched him with eyes of ice. Jon Snow also has dreams where the dead men stumble out of their graves beneath the castle. Jon is deathly afraid of what he might find down there. It says Jon dreamed he was wandering the empty castle, searching for his father, descending into the crypts. Only this time he had gone further than before. In the dark, he'd heard the scrape of stone on stone. When he turned, he saw that the vaults were opening one after the other, as the dead kings came stumbling from their cold black graves. Now I know some of you might be asking yourself what makes you think there are White Walkers or a Night's King locked up down there. Well, let me show you something else that I find to be very interesting from the books. When Ned Stark is down below the castle, it also says this: by ancient custom, an iron longsword had been laid across the lap of each who had been Lord of Winterfell, to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. That sounds very ominous to me. It sounds like the Starks were wanting to keep the vengeful spirits locked up forever. It says, in order to keep the spirits locked up, they have to keep iron longswords laying across the laps of the statues. I find it very interesting that they were using iron swords because of something Old Nan said. Do you remember what she said about the White Walkers and the things that they did not like? Old Nan said, the White Walkers were cold things, dead things, that hated iron and fire and the touch of the sun, and every creature with hot blood in its veins. So if the White Walkers are these vengeful spirits beneath Winterfell, what would you use to keep them locked up inside? Well, since they hate iron, you would most likely lay an iron longsword across the laps of each of the statues. That would be one of the ways you could stop them from getting out. Now you might be wondering, when would they have locked up a White Walker or Night's King down there? Is there any evidence for that? Well, yes. In one of Davos's chapters, we learn about a very interesting member of House Stark, who lived many, many years ago. This is also when we hear another reference of a winter that fell. This is what it says in his chapter. Then a long winter fell, said Sir Bartimaeus. The white knife froze hard, and even the firth was icing up. The winds came howling from the north and drove them slavers inside to huddle round their fires, and while they warmed themselves, the new king come down on them. Brandon Stark this was, Edric Snowbeard's great-grandson, him that men called Ice Eyes. He took the wolf's den back, stripped the slavers naked, and gave them to the slaves he'd found chained up in the dungeons. It's said they hung their entrails in the branches of the heart tree, as an offering to the gods. The old gods, not these new ones from the south. Your seven don't know winter, and winter don't know them. Now, I don't know about you, but this Brandon Ice Eyes sounds like he could have been some form of a White Walker or Night's King. Whenever we hear that a winter fell, we hear about someone or something coming down from the north with eyes of ice. Very similar to the Long Night, this Brandon Stark also seemed to bring some bad weather with him. It says, "The White Knife River froze hard, and even the Firth was icing up. The winds came howling from the north, when Brandon Ice Eyes showed up to deliver his justice." Since he was a king in the north, or a king of winter, he is most likely down in the crypts beneath Winterfell, and his eyes are still haunting the castle till this day. But once again, the best evidence comes from little old Nan. The one and only time a Night's King is actually referenced in the books, we learn that he was a Stark of Winterfell, who had to be slain by his own brother, the king in the north. I happen to believe the bodies of this Night's King, as well as his Night's Queen, were brought back to Winterfell to be locked up below the castle in their crypts. Now, if there are any vengeful spirits below Winterfell, I believe it would be that of this Brandon Stark, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Let's have a look at what Old Nan says so I can show you exactly what I mean. Old Nan says, he had been the 13th man to lead the Night's Watch, a warrior who knew no fear. And that was the fault in him, she would add, for all men must know fear. A woman was his downfall. A woman glimpsed from atop the wall, with skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. Fearing nothing, he chased her and caught her and loved her, though her skin was cold as ice. And when he gave his seed to her, he gave his soul as well. He brought her back to the Night Fort and proclaimed her a queen and himself her king. For 13 years they had ruled, Night's King and his corpse queen, until finally the Stark of Winterfell and Jormungand of the Wildlings had joined to free the Watch from bondage. After his fall, when it was found out he had been sacrificing to the others, all records of Night's King had been destroyed, his very name forbidden. So here we learn there was a man of the Night's Watch who loved a woman that sounded much like a White Walker herself. They were together for 13 years at the Night Fort, and it is said they were making sacrifices to the White Walkers beyond the wall. I believe they were sacrificing their own children. Now actually think about that for a second. If this Night's King was a Stark, like Old Nan says, and he was sleeping with a White Walker Night's Queen, that means those babies they were sacrificing to the others had Stark blood. Therefore, there are White Walkers beyond the wall who are half Stark. Remember, this is referenced in Bran Stark's very first chapter when he thinks about Old Nan's stories. He remembers she would say, Wildling woman would sleep with the White Walkers, creating these half-human, half-White Walker children. But all of that is just the setup for this massive revelation. Not only were the Wildlings doing that, but so was a Stark, a member of the family who has been battling these White Walkers since they first invaded Westeros during the Long Night. We have always seen the Starks as the good guys, but now we know they are somewhat responsible for keeping the White Walkers alive. I think this is absolutely fascinating. Now let me just finish what it says during Old Nan's story. Old Nan also said, "Some say he was a Bolton," Old Nan would always end. "Some say a Magnar out of Skagos, some say Umber, Flint, or Nori. Some would have you think he was a Woodfoot, from them who ruled Bear Island before the Iron Men came. He never was. He was a Stark, the brother of the man who brought him down. He was a Stark of Winterfell, and who can say, mayhaps his name was Brandon. Mayhaps he slept in this very bed, in this very room." Now what do you think happened to their bodies? It says when the Stark in Winterfell found out his own brother was making sacrifices to the White Walkers, he made sure all records of the Night's King had been destroyed and his very name forbidden. I would bet that his brother brought him back home but locked him up in the crypts deep beneath Winterfell. I would bet that this is one of those vengeful spirits Ned is hoping never comes out. Again, This is why there are iron longswords laying across their laps, because we know the others hated iron, and that would certainly keep them from rising up again. But old Ned Stark isn't so sure anymore. Those iron swords are beginning to rust away. Remember what it says in Ned's chapter. By ancient custom, an iron longsword had been laid across the lap of each who had been Lord of Winterfell, to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. The oldest had long ago rusted away to nothing, leaving only a few red stains where the metal had rested on stone. Ned wondered if that meant those ghosts were free to roam the castle now. He was hoping not.